Welcome. Over the next 2 hours we are going to look carefully and slowly at a crime that most people have never heard of, and that many will insist does not exist. This is part 1 of Knowledge Targeting, a 50-part documentary series from TI One Voice. It is called Organized Stalking, A Target's View, and it is built on the book of that name by Eleanor White. She was a retired engineer. That is how Eleanor White opens her argument, and it is worth sitting with. She does not claim that anything here is new. Ganging up on a person is as old as human groups. What she claims is that the old cruelty has been refined, organized, distributed across many hands, and tuned so that no single act looks criminal. The result, she argues, is a crime that leaves almost no trace. Knowledge targeting is an attempt to gather, in one place, everything the targeted individual community has managed to learn about its own situation. 50 episodes, roughly 2 hours each. It draws on a knowledge base of thousands of documents, books, declassified files, patents, court records, medical papers, and first-person testimony, assembled by TI One Voice. The aim is not to convince you of anything. The aim is to lay the material out honestly and let you weigh it. The series is organized into 7 thematic sections. The first defines the phenomenon and its vocabulary. The second examines the technology, what is demonstrated in the open literature, and what remains a claim. The third maps the institutional framework any sustained campaign would require. The fourth weighs whistleblower testimony. The last sections turn practical. Documentation, shielding, psychological survival, and the long legal road toward recognition. 50 episodes, built to be watched in order or dipped into. This is part 1 of 50, and the first of 10 episodes that make up section 1. Before it there was a series introduction which set out the scope of the project, where the sources come from, and the editorial rules we hold ourselves to. If you have not seen it, watch it when you can, but you do not need it today. This episode stands on its own, and it starts from the beginning. Part 2 is called The Anatomy of Gang Stalking, and the division of labor between the 2 episodes is deliberate. This one defines the crime, what it is, who it happens to, how large it might be, and why it is so hard to see. Part 2 takes that definition apart and examines the working parts, the tactics, the routines, the daily mechanics. Definition first, then dissection. That is the order White herself used. A word about where this series comes from. TI One Voice is a documentation platform built by targets for targets. It holds an evidence library where incidents can be recorded with dates, times, and locations. A knowledge base of thousands of source documents. A community wall, secure messaging, and structured interview tools that turn scattered memory into something an investigator could actually read. It is free to join. You will find it at TIOneVoice.org. There is also TI TV, a live stream that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, documentaries, interviews, recorded talks, and community programming, free to watch and needing no account. You will find it at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TI TV. And every part of this series exists as a written article too, with the sources listed so you can read what you have just heard and follow the citations yourself. It is fair to ask how a script like this gets written. Each section begins with a question put to the TI One Voice knowledge base. Thousands of documents, indexed so that passages can be retrieved by meaning rather than by keyword. The chapter of the book supplies the spine. The archive supplies the corroboration, the numbers, and the counterarguments. Where a claim appears in this episode, the document it came from can be named. For rules govern this series. Documented fact and contested claim are kept visibly apart. No private individual is named as a perpetrator, not by us and not in the testimony we quote. Quotations are short and attributed. And where the evidence runs out, we say so plainly. That last rule will matter often. The knowledge base itself records that no jurisdiction has codified organized stalking as a distinct crime, and we will not pretend otherwise. One more thing, for anyone watching who recognizes this from the inside. The next 2 hours describe harassment in close detail, including tactics that may be familiar. That can be hard listening. Nothing in this episode is a diagnosis, and nothing in it is advice about your own situation. We are not going to tell you what is or is not happening to you. Support and helpline links are in the description. Pause whenever you need to. Here is the road ahead. 5 questions, and the episode answers them in order. First, what is this thing precisely? Second, why does it happen to a particular person? Third, what did an investigator who says he spent years among these groups actually report? Fourth, how large is it if you read national crime statistics for the right signature? And fifth, the hardest one, why does describing it out loud make the describer sound unwell? So let us begin where the book begins, with its author. Every field of knowledge has a founding document, usually written by someone who was not trying to found anything. They were simply trying to make sense of a mess in front of them. That is what happened here. To understand organized stalking as the community now describes it, you first have to understand the woman who sat down and wrote the description. Eleanor White did not set out to write the first field guide to organized stalking. She was a retired engineer by training and by temperament. The knowledge-based biography describes a former United States Navy engineer who later lived and worked in Canada. Though almost nothing else about her early life is publicly documented, no confirmed birth date, no family record. What made her unusual was not her profession. It was that she was herself a target. For years, what she experienced looked like a cascade of unrelated bad luck. Strangers behaving oddly around her. Vehicles appearing at improbable moments. Neighbors acting on details of her private life they could not plausibly have known. She did what most people do. She questioned her own perceptions, kept quiet, and carried on. But engineers do not indefinitely tolerate systems they cannot model. Across the 1990s and the early 2000s, she stopped enduring it and started documenting it. Here is the moment that tells you what kind of source she is. White estimates that roughly 70% of targets can identify no precipitating reason at all for what happened to them. That is the central question of her own book, and she leaves it unanswered. No theory is invented to fill the hole. A writer willing to say we do not know about the thing readers most want explained is not manufacturing a tidy story. White wrote at a specific historical moment. The anti-stalking laws of the early 1990s had just been enacted across the United States, Canada, and much of Europe, statutes designed for a lone, obsessed pursuer harassing an ex-partner or a celebrity. At the same time, the early internet was letting isolated people find each other. The phrase gang stalking was circulating with no settled meaning. Her book arrived into that gap as an act of intellectual triage. What she produced was not a memoir and not a polemic. She called it, explicitly, an introduction for the general public and public officials to a crime they had never heard of. That is a modest ambition, and it shaped the writing. Plain definitions, categories, tables, sources. The document is cataloged in the TI One Voice knowledge base as number 765, and it is the primary source for the first 4 chapters of this work. She did not write in isolation, and she was careful about her sources. Of one fellow researcher she wrote approvingly that she, quote, avoids victim testimonials in favor of only factual objective material. She also knew the declassified record of SOINTELPRO, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program, which ran from 1956 to 1971. Note what she did not claim. She never said that program had secretly continued. She said the tactics resembled it. Which brings us to the premise underneath the whole book. White approached this not as a victim seeking validation, but as an analyst looking for structure, and the structure she found is the disturbing part. A crime can be engineered so that each separate act is trivial, every witness is honest, and the victim's own account sounds impossible. That property has a name, and it is the thread through everything that follows. The name is deniability. So let's begin where White begins, not with a definition, but with a feeling. Before you can define organized stalking, you have to sit with how strange it is. Because the strangeness is not incidental. It is the point. What she describes is an old crime. Ganging up on someone, rebuilt so carefully that the people standing closest to it will tell you, sincerely, that nothing is happening at all. That is the premise. That is the first sentence of Eleanor White's book, and it carries the whole paradox in compressed form. Read it slowly. Two claims sit inside it. First, the target cannot get away. Second, the witnesses, the neighbors, the colleagues, the passersby, will deny the thing they have just seen. Not lie about it. Deny it honestly, because from where they stand there is genuinely nothing to report. That gap is where we begin. White calls what targets experience a blizzard of harassment for which there is no apparent cause. Blizzard is the right word because it is not one event, it is density. At home, at work, in shops, on the road, among strangers, and among people they have known for years. Every facet of ordinary life develops a small, persistent friction, and no explanation arrives with it. That absence of cause matters enormously. Now take the blizzard apart, flake by flake. A rude stranger. Car alarm at 3 in the morning. A crowd that happens to fill the aisle you need. An appliance that fails. Parcel that never arrives. Individually, each of these is nothing, genuinely nothing, and any of us could list a dozen from the past month. That is precisely the design. The crime lives in the accumulation, never in the fragment. Follow what happens next because it runs in a circle. The act is small, so the bystander sees nothing. The target, who has seen hundreds, reports the pattern rather than the act. The pattern, described out loud, sounds impossible. The target is judged unreliable, and the next report is heard through that judgment. Each turn of the wheel makes the following turn easier. White argues the loop is engineered, not accidental. That is her claim. So here is the sentence to hold on to for the rest of this episode. Deniability is not a side effect of organized stalking. In White's account, deniability is the architecture, the thing the whole structure is built to produce. The perpetrators are not hiding the acts. They perform them in the open, in daylight, in front of witnesses. What they hide is the pattern by making every single act defensible on its own. White calls this an improved version of ganging up on someone, and the word improved is doing heavy work. The ancient version was crude. A mob, a village shunning, a crowd following someone down a lane, visible and therefore witnessable. You could call people to testify. The modern version, as she documents it, delivers every effect of being mobbed while the mob itself stays invisible. Not hidden in shadows, hidden in ordinariness. And notice how the system behaves at each rung of the ladder. The passerby who sees one staged moment sees nothing worth reporting. The officer who receives one complaint about one rude stranger files it, correctly, as a minor public order matter. The clinician who hears dozens of such moments, linked only by timing and private meaning, reaches for the vocabulary they were trained to use. Every one of them is behaving reasonably. That is the problem. Social psychology has a name for part of this. In the knowledge base entry on the bystander effect, Darley and Latena's classic finding is set out plainly. People intervene less when others are present, through diffusion of responsibility and simple fear of looking foolish. The entry is careful, and so are we. It notes that the same mechanism explains an action with no organized effort behind it whatsoever. It explains silence, proves nothing. The knowledge base entry on gaslighting traces the term to a 1938 play, Gaslight, in which a husband dims the lamps and then denies the light has changed. The clinical literature describes it as eroding a person's self-trust until they depend on someone else's version of reality. Targets describe exactly that sensation. But note the entry's caution. Critics argue the same feeling follows naturally from holding a fringe belief. Which brings us to the sentence at the center of White's premise. The target sees a coordinated campaign. The bystander sees literally nothing. And here is the uncomfortable part. Both descriptions are accurate accounts of what is in front of each person. Nobody has to be lying. Nobody has to be stupid. The gap between accumulated experience and fragmentary observation is, in White's argument, the engine that drives the entire crime. Closing that gap by documenting enough fragments from enough targets in enough detail is the project White sets herself, and it starts with getting the words right. So, if organized stalking is not a lone obsessed stalker, and she is emphatic that it is not, then what exactly is it? Her answer is a definition in 3 parts. We will take the first 2 now and the third at the end. White's full definition reads that organized stalking is surveillance and harassment of a designated target by stalkers who are members of groups, networked throughout the industrialist nations. 3 essential elements follow. Many, not one. Strangers handed a name. And groups tightly networked within a state or province and internationally. Each element is chosen to mark a break from conventional stalking, the model that every anti-stalking law we have was written around. Why does the definition matter more than it looks? Because the entire legal and institutional response to stalking, built over the past 3 decades, assumes one perpetrator and one victim who already know each other. Restraining orders assume a named person. Investigations assume a traceable motive. Take those assumptions to a case that has none of them, and the machinery does not merely struggle, it returns a confident answer, and the answer is wrong. Element 1. Many, not one. In a conventional case, the perpetrator makes himself known through repetition, the same face, the same car, the same unwanted contact. The victim can usually name him and describe the prior relationship. The investigation then follows a simple logic. Identify the suspect, evidence the pattern, apply the law. In organized stalking, White writes, the faces change. Monday's watcher is not Tuesday's. Repetition is there. Recurrence of any individual is not. Set the 2 side by side and the divergence is total. One pursuer against many in rotation. Someone known to the victim against strangers working from a list. A motive an investigator can trace against a motive severed from the hand that acts. And in the conventional case, moving away can work. In the organized case, targets report it does not. Every line on that comparison is a line where the existing law loses its grip. Is there a number? White cites 1. In her information handling notes, held in the knowledge base, she writes that increasingly detailed crime statistics began to show 1 stalking complaint in every 8 involves stalking by groups. Handle that figure with care. She does not name the dataset in that passage, and we have not been able to trace it to a published source. Treat it as her claim, not as an established finding. The vocabulary is a thicket, and it matters because the word you choose decides who takes you seriously. Gang stalking is the most common colloquial term, and it comes straight from element 1, many, not one. White prefers organized stalking. The knowledge base also lists group stalking, community stalking, cause stalking, and multi-stalking, plus the compound abbreviation OS/EH, meaning organized stalking and electronic harassment. Same phenomenon, different doors into it. Element 2. The people carrying out the harassment are handed the target's name, and usually do not know them beforehand. For many targets, this is the most corrosive part. Harassment from a former partner is painful but legible. You understand the relationship that produced it. Harassment from strangers who somehow know your routines, your private conversations, your medical history, is a different order of disorientation. No ordinary explanation covers how they know. And that word handed implies an intermediary, someone who gathers the information and passes it to people who have never met the target. It also protects the network. A stranger has no traceable motive. No background check will surface them because there is nothing to surface. Motive is severed from action, which leaves the third element, the one that turns a local nuisance into something far stranger. The network itself. We turn to it next. So the harassment comes from many, and those many are strangers handed a name. White's third element changes the scale of the entire question. These groups, she says, are networked locally, nationally, and across national borders. Her evidence is not a document or an organization chart. It is an effect that targets describe over and over again. The harassment does not stop when they leave. It follows them and it arrives before they do. In conventional stalking, distance works. The stalker is one person in one place with one set of resources. Move city, change job, cut off contact, and the pattern usually breaks. White argues that organized stalking does not behave like that. Relocating, she says, only moves the target to a different node of the same network. The cast of faces changes. The timing, the tactics, and the accumulating coincidences targets report do not change at all. What targets describe is a resumption. They move for work or for safety or simply to test the theory. For days, sometimes weeks, nothing happens. Then the pattern reassembles around them, staffed by people who could not have known them through any ordinary social channel. That is the report. What is documented here is the reporting itself, consistently and across decades. The mechanism that would carry a name from one town to another is not. In a separate paper on information handling, White cites crime statistics that she says show one stalking complaint in every 8 involving a group rather than a lone individual. She uses that to argue police already hold the numbers, and still tell targets organized stalking does not happen. We could not trace the underlying dataset from her citation. So treat the figure as White's claim about the statistics, not as a verified statistic itself. How would such a network actually work? White is careful here, and her caution is worth noticing. She does not claim to know whether there is a central coordinating body, a loose federation of local groups swapping names and information, or some mixture of the two. She documents an effect and declines to invent a mechanism to explain it. That restraint is unusual in this literature, and it is one reason her book has lasted. Her strongest argument is a negative one. A delusion, she reasons, does not reassemble itself in a new city, with new strangers, who somehow know the same private details. Therefore, the continuity across distance must be organization. Now hold that argument up to the light. It is a real argument, and it is not proof because it depends entirely on the accuracy of the very reports it is built upon. The mainstream position is the opposite one, and this series states it plainly rather than hiding it. Our own knowledge base entry on organized stalking opens by describing it as a belief system rather than a documented phenomenon, and notes there is no independent verification of its core claims. Both things can be true at once. The reports are real and consistent, and the coordinating network behind them has never been evidenced. Which brings us to the question that decides everything else. If this is organized, who does the organizing, and more importantly, who does the actual work? Here White's answer is the most uncomfortable finding in her book, and also the most useful. The people carrying out the harassment are not, in the main, trained operatives. They are, she says, the people already around you doing something they believe is entirely reasonable. Neighbors, co-workers, passers-by, fellow commuters, the person behind the counter at a shop the target visits every single week. That is White's characterization of the workforce, and it needs an immediate warning label attached. A neighbor walking a dog is just a neighbor walking a dog. This series will never name a private individual as a perpetrator, and ordinary behavior, however badly timed it feels, is not by itself evidence of anything. White's structural argument for ordinary participants is genuinely strong, whatever you conclude about the rest of it. Professionals are expensive, scarce, and traceable. They leave payroll records and case files behind them. Ordinary people, recruited slowly and handed a story that frames their part as protective, are cheap, abundant, and effectively invisible. They have no criminal records. They have no known associations. Questioned, they can honestly say they were going about their business. The one outsider who claims to have got inside is David Lawson. Our knowledge base entry describes him as a Florida private investigator, and before that a police officer who spent roughly 12 years investigating these groups across the United States and Canada. He found them, by his own account, through a routine radio scanner. He then spent years riding along with them. His book appeared in 2001. White's summary of what Lawson found is a single phrase, and it does more work than pages of theory ever would. The groups he rode with, she writes, assumed the role of some sort of special community police. Not criminals in their own minds. Not paid operatives either. Enforcers, self-appointed, quietly convinced that the people they were following had somehow earned it. That self-image is the engine of the entire thing. Take that phrase apart. Nobody deputized them. There is no badge, no warrant, no oversight, no complaints procedure, and no legal standing of any kind behind what they do. Yet Lawson's account suggests many participants genuinely hold the belief, seeing their own behavior as civic duty rather than harassment, keeping an eye on a suspicious person, doing what the formal police, for whatever reason, apparently will not or cannot do. White is not at all uncritical of Lawson, and that matters. She writes that targets give him excellent marks for his observations while riding with the groups, and rather lower marks for his conclusions about who is ultimately responsible. Observation and personal speculation sit mixed together in his books. One observation she highlights. When Lawson raised the subject with serving officers, some of them said group harassment simply amounted to protected free speech. White then goes further than Lawson, and here we need to be exact about what kind of statement she is making. She hypothesizes a long-running program to recruit, train, and vet reliable enforcers over time. She does not say who runs it. She offers no document, no whistleblower, no budget line, and no prosecution. This is a hypothesis clearly labeled as one, and it should be weighed as a hypothesis. The structure she proposes has 3 distinct layers, and its internal logic holds up even where the evidence does not. At the top, a small number of coordinators who choose the target and know that the story told about them is false. In the middle, recruiters who frame the request as ordinary community safety. And at the base, a large body of participants who believe they are simply being vigilant neighbors. Now, is that structure plausible? Set White aside and look at what is documented. Civilian informant networks are not a fringe idea. They are recurring, official, and thoroughly recorded. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Counterintelligence Program, from 1956. A lawsuit over political surveillance in 1971. InfraGard in 1996. Citizen Corps in 2002. And in 2011, disclosed informant networks inside New York's Muslim communities. None of that proves organized stalking exists. It proves only that the infrastructure for enlisting ordinary citizens as watchers is real, official, and repeatedly rebuilt. The harder question is psychological. Would ordinary people actually do this? In 1961, Stanley Milgram began his obedience experiments at Yale and found that a large majority of ordinary volunteers would inflict what they believed was serious pain when instructed by an apparent authority. Solomon Asch had already shown, back in the 1950s, how readily people abandon the evidence of their own eyes to match a confident group. Our knowledge base entry on social proof applies both findings here. Recruits are told that everyone agrees the target is dangerous, and that helping out is a civic duty. The tasks handed to them are individually trivial. No single act ever feels like a crime. And that is the hinge of the whole thing. Nobody is asked, on day one, to harass a stranger. The first request is small, reasonable, and phrased in the borrowed language of neighborhood watch. What follows is a ladder, and every rung is short enough that no rung ever feels like a line being crossed. Next, we climb that ladder and meet the story that makes climbing it feel righteous. Hold that finding in mind because the structural logic follows from it. Professionals would be expensive, scarce, and above all traceable. They leave employers' payments and records behind them. Ordinary people leave almost nothing. No criminal history, no known associations, unremarkable lives built around jobs, families, and routines, and a role in the harassment that fills a small fraction of any week. That is not a weakness in the design. That is the design. Set the two workforces side by side and the contrast does the arguing for you. A professional crew is small, paid, trained, and attached to an employer a subpoena can reach. A network of ordinary neighbors has no employer, no payroll, no paper trail, and no scarcity. Anyone who drops out is replaced by the following week. White's point is not that professionals are never involved. It is that they are not required. David Lawson, the private investigator whose 12-year undercover work we examine in a later chapter, described groups that saw themselves as a kind of special community police. No one deputized them. There is no badge, no warrant, no oversight, no complaint process, and no legal standing of any kind behind what they do. Yet Lawson's account suggests the self-image is not merely a story told to outsiders. Many participants appear to believe it themselves. That belief matters more than any organizational chart, because it converts harassment into duty. Seen from the inside, the participant is not persecuting a stranger. He is keeping an eye on a suspicious house. He is doing what the formal police, for whatever reason, cannot or will not do. Every word of the vocabulary is borrowed from something legitimate: watchfulness, community safety, looking out for neighbors, and borrowed language makes refusing feel unreasonable. White goes further than Lawson on one point. She hypothesizes a long-running program to recruit, train, and vet reliable enforcers over years. She does not say by whom. Be clear about the status of that. It is a hypothesis, unnamed and uncorroborated, and here the evidence runs out. She concedes the limit herself elsewhere, writing that there is no evidence at this time tying organized stalking to any specific government or private entity. Notice what the reframing buys. Questioned later, a participant can say honestly that they were simply going about their business, because from inside their own account that is exactly what they were doing. There is no lie to detect, no guilty knowledge to trip over, no story that falls apart under pressure. An investigator hunting for a conspirator finds instead a neighbor genuinely puzzled by the question. Sincerity is the strongest cover there is. Nobody is asked on day one to harass a stranger. The first ask is small. Keep an eye on that house. Mention anything unusual. Mentioning becomes reporting on a schedule. Reporting becomes coordinating with others who report. Coordination becomes showing up at a set time, driving a set route, saying a particular sentence within earshot. Each step is small measured against the step before it, so no step ever feels like a line being crossed. By the end of that ladder, the participant is doing something that, described from outside, is unambiguously harassment. Reversing course is genuinely hard, not because anyone is coercing them, but because admitting complicity in something unjustified now costs more than continuing. The knowledge base entry on social proof puts the mechanism plainly. The assigned tasks are individually minor, staring, blocking, noise-making, so no single act feels criminal, while the cumulative effect on the target is severe. Lawson's field notes concentrate on vehicles. Groups run rotations. One car follows for a stretch, drops away, another picks the target up, and the faces behind the wheel change through the day like shifts. Targets in many countries describe the same choreography on foot. The knowledge base notes that this mirrors the ABC method taught in published surveillance manuals. Several people rotating positions, crossing the street, handing the follow to one another. White cites a figure that deserves careful handling. She writes that as crime statistics grew more detailed, one stalking complaint in every 8 was found to involve stalking by groups. That comes from her own paper, Information Handling, held in the knowledge base. We have not independently verified the underlying statistic, and you should treat it as her claim rather than an established finding. If it is even roughly right, group stalking is not exotic. So why do people take part? The honest answer is that motives differ, and most of them are ordinary. Some want the belonging that comes with being inside a group that has a mission. Some want the small authority of being trusted with a secret task. Some are simply afraid of what refusing would cost. The knowledge base notes that organizers may present themselves as police, private investigators, or community safety coordinators. None of that works without a story, and the story is what White calls the lie campaign. We give it a full chapter later, but it belongs here because it is inseparable from the perpetrator question. The mechanism is simple enough. A set of vicious rumors is seeded about the target, chosen for social toxicity rather than plausibility, and pushed through existing networks until enough people nearby carry them as background fact. White's list continues past that sentence, and the final item is chosen deliberately. When supervisors want maximum effort from their troops, she writes, the target is called a pedophile. The escalation is not accidental. An accusation of theft earns cold shoulders. An accusation involving children overrides ordinary skepticism entirely, because the perceived stakes reframe not taking part as complicity. That single label recruits people who would never otherwise follow a stranger down a street. Pause on the 2 words White reaches for their supervisors and troops. That vocabulary implies tasking, effort levels, and a chain of command, not spontaneous gossip. Whether it is accurate in every case is something nobody can verify from the outside, so mark it as her framing rather than proof. It does fit the architecture she describes. A small coordinating core who know the rumors are false, and a large body of participants who do not. One more thing has to be said carefully. White wrote before the smartphone era. A network needing to know where somebody is right now would today need no radios and no dispatcher, only a group chat and a location pin. That is inference, not evidence, and we flag it as inference. The knowledge base is blunt on the point. The connection is speculative, and no documented evidence supports the existence of organized gang stalking programs. Which leaves an uncomfortable conclusion. If White's account holds, most participants are themselves casualties of the system, not of the harassment they inflict, but of the lie that made the harassment feel righteous. That excuses nobody. Harassment is still harassment, whatever story the harasser believes about it. But it does explain why the crime is so durable, and why removing a single organizer would leave most of the machinery still standing. Turn now to a problem that sounds merely academic and is in fact one of this crime's best defenses. Organized stalking has no settled name. It travels under a dozen labels, and the list itself is part of the evidence, because each label leads to a different fragment of the literature, a different online community, a different set of assumptions. Scatter the vocabulary and you scatter the evidence base with it. Here is the field laid out. Some names emphasize the group. Some emphasize the setting. Some emphasize the alleged motive, and some describe the tactics. The last 4 belong to a second and far more contested lexicon, about technology rather than people. Most of these were not coined by researchers. They were reached for by isolated targets describing an experience for which no standard word existed. The fragmentation is mostly organic. Its effect is not. One strand of that vocabulary is academically established, and it deserves to be said plainly. Mobbing has its own literature, built by the Swedish psychologist Heinz Lehmann in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He documented social isolation, humiliation, excessive monitoring, meaningless tasks, and rumor, driving a chosen employee out of an organization. Peer-reviewed, replicated, taught in occupational health. The resemblance to what targets describe is not something anyone has to argue for. So hold the comparison that comes next. Stalking itself only became prosecutable once it had one agreed name and statutes to match, which arrived in the United States with the anti-stalking laws of the early 1990s. Before that, the same behavior was chopped up between harassment, trespass, and breach of peace charges, incident by incident. The naming was not cosmetic. It was the infrastructure of recognition. Organized stalking sits today roughly where stalking sat in 1985. So much for the human vocabulary. Alongside it sits a second lexicon, and it is far more contested. Targets in many countries, speaking different languages, have independently reported sensations they attribute to technology rather than to people alone. White records those terms without adjudicating them. We will do the same here. Our job in this part is the vocabulary, not the physics. The physics gets its own episodes later on its own merits. Electronic assault is the umbrella. Underneath it sit directed energy weapons, shortened to DW, non-lethal weapons, the broader military and police category, voice-to-skull, shortened to V2K, and mind control, the most contested phrase in the whole field. Some communities fold the lot together as OS/EH, organized stalking and electronic harassment. These are labels people use. Whether the devices exist in deployable form is a separate question, and not this episode's question. Voice-to-skull is the community's name for hearing speech or sound that seems to come from inside the head rather than from the room. White notes that the United States Army's own technical thesaurus has, at various points, carried an entry using that same abbreviation. That is a documented fact about a glossary. It is not, by itself, proof that a fielded weapon exists. Hold those two statements apart. The distinction matters enormously later. There is a real scientific kernel here. In 1961, Alan Fry described what became known as the microwave auditory effect. Pulsed microwaves can make a person perceive clicks or buzzing. Our knowledge base entry on those experiments is blunt about the gap that follows. Simple induced sound is documented. Intelligible speech delivered covertly at range to one chosen person is not. Between those two sentences lies almost the entire electronic controversy. Directed energy weapons are not a fringe invention. Lasers, high-power microwaves, and acoustic systems are openly researched, and the knowledge base notes that the United States established a joint non-lethal weapons directorate in 1997, funding acoustic, laser, and radio frequency work. The active denial system is a real millimeter wave device. What is not established is the miniaturized, concealed, individually aimed version that targets describe. That is the claim, and later parts will test it properly. That sentence is the methodological spine of this whole series. The human tactics are documented well enough to stand alone. The electronic claims are examined separately, on their own evidence, in their own episodes. Treating them as a package deal, believe everything or dismiss everything, is exactly the overreach that has left this subject open to blanket ridicule. Separation here is not skepticism about targets. It is a form of protection for them. Why does a scattered vocabulary matter so much? Consider stalking itself. Until the anti-stalking statutes of the early 1990s, the behavior we now call stalking was prosecuted under harassment, trespass, and breach of peace laws, each incident handled in isolation, the pattern invisible. The naming was not cosmetic. It was the infrastructure of recognition. Organized stalking today sits almost exactly where stalking sat in 1985, real, numerous, and legally nameless. Which brings us to what may be White's single most useful idea, and the concept the rest of this series leans on. She calls it the master menu. Organized stalking, she argues, is not one fixed script that every target lives through identically. It is a large shared catalog of techniques, from which each target's particular program is assembled, piece by piece, like a custom order taken in a restaurant. One target is hit hardest at work, through exclusion, sabotage, and mobbing. Another is hit on the road, through vehicle convoys, staged near misses and traffic that never quite feels random. Another is hit at home by noise campaigns and watchers, until the one place that should be safe is not. Another is hit mostly in public, through staged encounters that carry private meanings no bystander could ever read. Same menu, for different meals. White sorts the catalog into 4 rough domains. First, things done in the community and in public. Second, the electronic layer that targets report sitting on top of the human one. Third, institutional attacks, workplace mobbing, school harassment, and the weaponization of the mental health system, which she calls the ultimate punishment. Fourth, social attacks. The rumor campaign that turns a target's own circle against them. Each domain gets its own operational chapter later in this series. Here is the objection skeptics reach for first. Sit 10 targeted people in a room and you hear 10 different emphases, one fixed on noise, one on vehicles, one on workplace exclusion, one on electronic sensations. To an outsider, that sounds like 10 private delusions rather than one shared crime. Under the menu model, divergence is precisely what you would predict. Be careful, though, this reframes the objection. It does not settle it. White's inference runs like this. A single fixed script, identical for everyone, would actually be easier to fake and easier to dismiss as a story spreading through online forums. Customization costs coordination, people, and time. So the variety in testimony, she argues, is a fingerprint of tailoring rather than a symptom of unreliability. That is a reasonable argument from pattern. It is not, on its own, documentary proof of a controlling network. Take the road, one of the most frequently reported areas of the menu. White, drawing on David Lawson, describes convoys of 6 to 30 vehicles, sometimes all running high beams. Targets report being boxed in and held at a chosen speed. And crucially, one group peels away and another takes over. Whether or not that is coordination, it has the practical effect of defeating any log a target keeps. Nothing recurs. Nothing accumulates. Sit with that number for a moment because it is the crux of the whole subject. 6 to 30 vehicles, for one person on one journey. If true, that implies a standing pool of participants far larger than most people would find plausible. And here the evidence runs out. The figure comes from David Lawson's own field observation, reported by White. It is not an audited dataset, and no court has confirmed it. At home, the reported tactic is noise, but the detail that matters is timing. White writes that stalkers use their cars to honk horns or squeal tires as they pass the target's home, and time noise to the moment the target steps outside. Knowledge base accounts add tapping on walls at night, doors slammed in apartment blocks, and neighbors who appear entirely oblivious. Sleep in every account is the objective. This is where a concept called sensitization enters. The claim, as our knowledge base summarizes it, borrows directly from Pavlov. Pair a neutral cue, a red car, a jangled set of keys, a particular cough with something distressing, repeat it, and the cue alone starts producing alarm. It is an elegant explanation. It is also the same entry notes, unsupported by any law enforcement or academic documentation. Mechanism proposed, not demonstrated. Now to the tactic White treats as the purest expression of the whole method. She calls it street theater. Small, brief harassment scenes performed in public, in the target's view, by strangers who look like ordinary passersby. Community literature in our knowledge base describes them as skits, deliberately built to imitate the ordinary breaks of daily living. The content often carries a private meaning only the target would recognize. No one else in the street sees anything. One target community account in our knowledge base puts the paradox plainly. Street theater sounds comic, yet it is perfect cover for whoever is doing it. And the same document makes a sharper point. Many people know in advance that describing what they are experiencing will discredit them, so they delay complaining, or delay even admitting it to themselves. The tactic damages the target twice. Once when performed, once when reported. And that leaves the target with a genuinely cruel choice. Describe one incident and it sounds like nothing. A stranger coughed, a car honked, someone repeated a phrase. Describe the pattern instead, and you are now asserting coordination you cannot demonstrate, which sounds like paranoia. Either way, the listener's confidence drops. Most targets learn fairly quickly to stop talking. That silence, White argues, is not incidental. It is the point. Which brings us to the principle underneath all of it. The menu decides what is done to a target. Something else decides how it looks. A staged encounter looks like a random interaction. A noise campaign sounds like inconsiderate neighbors. A convoy looks like traffic. Each item, viewed alone, is trivially explainable as something other than what it is. That staging principle is the machinery of deniability, and it is where we go next. So the menu exists, and it is strikingly consistent from country to country. But a menu of tactics is only half the story. What makes those tactics work is not their cruelty. It is their design. Every item on that list shares one property, and it is the property this chapter is about. Each act is built to be explained away. That is the machinery of deniability, and it is the keystone of the whole phenomenon. Eleanor White's claim is not that the harassment is subtle. It is that the harassment is engineered so that reporting it damages the person who reports. The group structure, the customized tactics, the staged encounters, the rumor campaigns, all of it is arranged around a single outcome. Complain, and you sound worse than you did before you opened your mouth. Follow that loop carefully because everything else in this episode rests on it. White describes 6 steps, and they form a circle rather than a line. An act looks like bad luck. A bystander catches one fragment. The target, carrying hundreds of fragments, finally reports, and the report sounds implausible. The complaint is treated as a symptom. The label destroys credibility. With credibility gone, the harassment can escalate freely, which produces more acts, and the circle turns again, tighter each time. Notice how ordinary every single step is. Step 1 is the foundation. A stranger is rude. A crowd forms at the wrong moment. A car horn sounds precisely as you step off the curb. Taken singly, each event has an innocent explanation ready-made, and that explanation is usually correct for most people, most days. The knowledge base entry on plausible deniability describes exactly this. A structural feature of covert work that lets those responsible disclaim knowledge even when evidence suggests otherwise. That sentence deserves a moment. White is not describing people who lie for money. She is describing people who genuinely saw one small thing and honestly concluded it was nothing. The target sees a coordinated campaign. The bystander sees literally nothing. Both descriptions are accurate accounts of what stood in front of them. The gap between those two accurate views is the engine of the entire crime. Closing that gap is the whole documentation problem. Step 2 explains why. The crime is distributed across many actors and many moments, so no single person sees the whole. A neighbor sees one event. A colleague sees 2. A brother sees 5 spread over a year. Each of them is judging a sample of 1, and a sample of 1 always looks like ordinary life. Only the target holds the full sequence, and the target is the only witness nobody will believe. Step 3 arrives when the target finally speaks. 100 trivial events, recited together, sound like a mind finding meaning in noise. The very scale that proves the pattern is the thing that makes it sound like delusion. Step 4 is the reply. White reports from officials across several countries. There is no organized stalking, and you need to see a psychiatrist. The request for help has become a symptom. It is worth being precise about what White claims here. She writes that every single official gives the same reply. That is a generalization. She surveyed no police force and no clinic. What can be said is narrower and still striking. The same refusal recurs in target accounts from several countries, and the knowledge base records that no jurisdiction treats organized stalking as a distinct crime. Treat the uniformity as a tendency, not a law. Step 5 is where the loop bites. Once a label exists, every later complaint is read through it. However careful the documentation, the file now opens with a diagnosis rather than an allegation. Step 6 follows automatically. A person nobody believes is a person nobody protects, so the harassment can widen without cost. Each revolution leaves the target less credible, less defended, and more alone than the last. No new tactic is required, only a lower threshold. Here is the most unsettling property of the loop. It closes without anyone deciding to close it. The officer follows training. The clinician follows guidelines. The neighbor follows a rumor they half believe. No single participant needs to know about the others, and none of them thinks of themselves as covering anything up. The system, running on its own ordinary logic, converts a real complaint into an unreasonable one. That is a design, not a conspiracy. Is deniability by design a real thing, or only a theory targets need? On this point, history is unambiguous. The knowledge base entry on Zersitzung, the East German decomposition method, states the principle plainly. Each individual action, taken alone, appears innocuous, and only the cumulative pattern reveals the orchestration. Those who complained were often dismissed as unstable, which the security service treated as a useful outcome rather than an accident. The lineage is documented. In 1956, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began SOINTLPRO. In 1971, stolen files exposed it. By 1975, the Church Committee had documented anonymous letters sent to the spouses and employers of targeted people, containing fabricated allegations. In 1976, an East German directive formalized decomposition as policy. Deniable harassment of individuals by institutions is not speculative. It has a paper trail. What remains contested is whether it continues today. The loop needs one more component to work, and White gives it a name: the lie campaign. Before the harassment begins or alongside it, a story is placed. The target is a drug dealer, a child abuser, an informant, a security risk. The Church Committee proved this method existed. What targets describe is the same technique running through neighbors, employers, and family, where the accusation never reaches the accused. That last detail is the whole trick. Isolation is not a side effect of the lie campaign. It is the point. Every relationship lost is a potential witness removed, and a witness removed is deniability gained. Knowledge base material on the East German method lists social isolation through systematic rumor as a standard tool. One document circulating in the community claims co-opting friends and family is surprisingly easy. That document is anonymous and unverified, so treat the claim cautiously. And here the trap tightens again. A person who stops going out, who stops answering calls, who scans the street before leaving, looks exactly like a case of paranoia. The behavior is identical whether the cause is illness or accurate perception acted upon. Nothing in the observed behavior distinguishes the two. That ambiguity is not the target's fault and not the clinician's fault. The interpretation already on file wins by default. White does point to numbers, and they deserve careful handling. She cites official statistics indicating roughly one stalking case in 8 involves more than one perpetrator, in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. A knowledge base entry records a Freedom of Information response describing over 185,000 stalking incidents involving coordinated groups. Multiple perpetrators is not the same as organized stalking. It is, however, a category that exists. Why does the refusal happen so consistently? A knowledge base analysis of complaint outcomes gives 3 structural reasons rather than malice. Anti-stalking procedures require naming a specific suspect, which a distributed campaign makes impossible. Officers trained for conventional crime have no framework for what is described, and there is rarely physical evidence to seize. Add ordinary caseload pressure, and the file closes without anyone behaving badly at all. The consequence for the target is identical either way. So what can be done? The community's answer has been to log everything: date, time, location, description, and often an impact rating. Knowledge base entries note the honest limits of this. Such logs have no recognized evidentiary value in court, and critics warn they can entrench confirmation bias. Their real value is different. A time-stamped record turns memory into data, and enough records from enough people can be compared. That is the one bridge across the fragment gap. White adds one further structural point, and it is the sharpest in the chapter. A person formally accused of a crime can face their accuser, see the evidence, answer it, and be acquitted. In what she describes, none of that exists. There is no visible accuser, no charge, no hearing, no verdict, and no mechanism of exoneration. A criminal defendant, however badly treated, at least has a process. The person she describes has none at all. Hold on to one conclusion before we move on. Deniability is not a side effect of organized stalking as White describes it. It is the operating system. Every tactic is chosen for it, and the loop runs on it. And the loop has one component that does the heaviest lifting of all, the one that converts a complainant into a patient. That component is psychiatry, and we turn to it next. The machinery of deniability has one last component, and it is the one targets fear most. Every tactic we have described relies on the incident looking trivial. This one does not. It works on the reporter rather than the report. That component is the mental health system. Eleanor White places it apart from the rest of her master menu, not because it happens most often, but because it is the most effective at ending the argument. Before anything else, the ground rules. Psychiatry is not the enemy of this series. Mental illness is real, it is common, and it causes enormous suffering. Some people who believe they are targeted are unwell, and they deserve care rather than argument. We do not diagnose anyone here, in either direction. The claim on the table is narrower and colder than that. It concerns what happens to a complaint once it is reclassified. The mechanism is simple in structure. A target describes staged encounters, noise at unlikely hours, strangers who seem to know private details. To a listener who has never experienced it, the account sounds implausible, and implausibility invites a clinical response rather than a criminal one. The problem is relocated. It is no longer in the world. It is in the reporter's perception of the world. That relocation is the whole trick. The knowledge base entry on workplace mobbing describes the same sequence in 4 steps, drawn from the occupational health literature. First, the target reports a pattern of surveillance or sabotage. Second, the report is dismissed as paranoia or conspiracy thinking. Third, the beliefs are recast in diagnostic language, persecutory delusion. Fourth, the label is used to justify what follows: dismissal from a job, loss of standing, sometimes hospitalization. That 4th step is where a description becomes a lever. Eleanor White calls forced psychiatric treatment the ultimate punishment. In her own words, the injustice, quote, pretty well disables further attempts by the target to get the crime remedied, end quote. Read that carefully. She is not claiming treatment is torture. She is describing a consequence. After the label, the door to redress is closed, and every later attempt to open it pushes it further shut. That is the structural claim, and it is testable. White's phrase is not hyperbole once you compare the two. A prison sentence has a charge attached, a fixed end date, and a process of appeal. A diagnostic label has none of those. It has no accuser you can cross-examine and no expiry. It travels with the person into every later encounter with police, courts, employers, and clinics, quietly coloring everything they say afterwards with the presumption that their perceptions cannot be trusted. No force was required. The second cruelty is that the symptoms of genuine illness and the predictable effects of being harassed overlap almost exactly. Hypervigilance, constantly scanning a room for threats, is a recognized feature of several anxiety and trauma disorders. It is also the rational behavior of someone under coordinated surveillance. The behavior is identical. Only the cause differs, and cause is precisely what a short clinical appointment is least equipped to establish. The same doubling runs through the rest of the list. Distrust of others is, in some presentations, a diagnostic criterion for delusional disorder. For someone actually being watched and talked about, it is an accurate reading of the room. Social withdrawal can be scored as a negative symptom of schizophrenia. It is also what most people would do if every trip outdoors produced another staged encounter. 2 readings, 1 behavior. Put the steps in a circle and the trap becomes visible. The target reports. The account sounds implausible. The referral goes to mental health services rather than to an investigator. The complaint is recorded as a symptom. And then the crucial turn. The target protests that it is real, and the protest itself is scored as further evidence of the delusion. The harder they argue, the more certain the diagnosis looks. White lays out the available moves, and every one of them closes. Seek help for the anxiety and insomnia, and the clinical encounter may pathologize the cause along with the effect. Stay silent and carry the damage without support. Go to the police and be referred to mental health services. Go to mental health services and risk the label that makes every later police report useless. Each apparent exit leads back inside. It is important to be precise about blame here. This is not, in most cases, malpractice. A clinician facing a report they consider impossible has a default, and the default is to treat the report as a symptom. That default is correct almost every time. The diagnostic system was built for a world in which organized stalking does not occur. It works exactly as designed. The assumptions underneath it are what is in question. The category itself is not settled ground. A knowledge base entry on delusional disorder notes that the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published in 2013, dropped the requirement that a delusion be non-bizarre. That change widened the criteria and drew criticism from within psychiatry. A separate knowledge base entry records that the American Psychiatric Association does not recognize targeted individual as a clinical diagnosis at all. Behind the diagnosis stands the thing targets name most often when asked what frightens them: involuntary commitment. In most jurisdictions, a physician, and sometimes a police officer, can detain a person for assessment against their will on a judgment of risk. That power exists for good reasons, and it saves lives. It is also, for someone reporting organized stalking, the point at which a disbelieved account can cost them their liberty. The consequence runs further than the individual case. Once targets understand what a report can cost, many stop reporting. They learn to describe the noise but not the pattern, the vandalism but not the strangers. Some stop seeking medical care of any kind. The rational response to the trap is silence, and silence looks, from outside, exactly like absence. A crime that suppresses its own reporting cannot be counted, and what is not counted is not studied. Even ordinary stalking is badly served. A knowledge-based summary of the 2009 Department of Justice Stalking Victimization Study reports that around 60% of victims said police took no action on their complaint. That is the baseline for a crime that is recognized, legislated for, and understood. White's argument is that organized stalking targets are held to a standard higher still, and for a structural reason. White's next observation will be familiar to anyone who has tried to file. A victim of a street assault reports it, describes one attacker, and is taken seriously even if nobody is ever caught. A burglary victim lists what is missing and gets a crime number. A target of organized stalking is asked instead for a single identifiable perpetrator and a single chargeable incident. Precisely the two things the crime is engineered never to produce. So the target logs everything. Every staged encounter, every noise incident, every vehicle. And here the logs betray them. Each single entry is so trivial that it proves nothing on its own. The pattern only appears when the entries are aggregated across months, and aggregation is meaningless to a system that weighs evidence one incident at a time. The only proof that would count is the one form the crime prevents from existing. None of this is speculative. Punitive psychiatry against dissidents is documented history. Through the 1960s and 70s, Soviet clinicians applied a diagnosis called sluggish schizophrenia to people whose principal symptom was political disagreement. The pressure became so severe that in 1983 the Soviet Psychiatric Society resigned from the World Psychiatric Association rather than face expulsion. 6 years later, officials conceded that the diagnosis had been used politically against opponents of the state. East Germany went further and wrote it down. The knowledge base entry on Zersitzung, German for decomposition, describes the Stasi's doctrine of covert psychological warfare, formalized in a directive of 1976. The aim was to break a person without arresting them. Anonymous threats, ruined careers, engineered rumors, and a reputation quietly dismantled among neighbors. It is, on the record, the most extensively documented state program of deniable harassment in modern history. Here is the structural claim stripped of everything else. A system in which one category of complaint automatically invalidates the person making it cannot detect that category of crime, whether or not the crime is occurring. That is a statement about the system, not about any target. And it raises an obvious question. Has a documented program ever done to real people what White describes? In the United States, yes. It has a name. So the complaint invalidates itself, and the person making it learns to stop making it. Hold that trap in mind because we now leave testimony behind entirely. For the next stretch of this episode, we stand on the firmest ground it has. Not what targets say, not what White infers. What a government investigated, documented, and published about itself, in records anyone can read today. The precedent has a name. Counterintelligence Program. Shortened in the Bureau's own filing system to COINTELPRO. It ran from 1956 to 1971, and for 15 of those years almost nobody outside the Federal Bureau of Investigation knew that it existed. What we know now, we know because the program's own paperwork eventually reached the public. Everything in this section comes from those documents and from the Senate investigation that followed them, not from any target's account. COINTELPRO was never one operation. It was a series of programs, each aimed at a category the Bureau had decided was subversive. The targets were not confined to one side of politics. They included the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Ku Klux Klan, civil rights organizations including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Black Panther Party, and the anti-war movement broadly. The director authorized it, and the files carry his initials. For dates hold the whole story. 1956. The first program opens. 1971. A burglary in a small Pennsylvania town puts the files into the hands of reporters, and the programs are shut down within weeks. 1975. The Senate convenes an investigation. 1976. It publishes. Everything the public knows flows through that gap of 15 years between the doing and the telling. Nobody voluntarily disclosed any of it. On the 8th of March, 1971, while most of America watched a heavyweight title fight, 8 people broke into a small bureau office in Media, Pennsylvania. They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They took roughly 1,000 files and mailed them to journalists and to congressmen. On one routing slip sat a word nobody outside the Bureau had ever seen. None of the burglars was caught. The declassified files and the Senate report described 5 methods. Infiltration. Informants and provocateurs placed inside groups to gather intelligence and to provoke. Psychological warfare. False rumors engineered to wreck reputations and split organizations. Media manipulation. Friendly journalists fed stories, sympathetic coverage suppressed. Legal harassment. Police, prosecutors, employers and landlords nudged into taking action. And neutralization, the stated goal. Read that list again with a modern targets account beside it. The anonymous letter was the workhorse. The Senate committee documented letters sent to spouses, to employers, to associates, carrying fabricated allegations of infidelity, criminal activity, or political extremism. The knowledge base entry on the New Left program records forged letters reaching landlords and university administrators too. Former employees confirmed the Bureau could produce forgeries of professional quality. The letter arrives, the recipient believes it, and the damage is then done by somebody else entirely. The most refined tactic had a name inside the Bureau, the snitch jacket. You do not attack the target directly. You make the target's own people believe that he is an informant. Then his community does the work for you, the suspicion, the exclusion, the slow withdrawal. The knowledge base notes how closely that mirrors what targets describe now. Not being attacked, but being quietly dropped by everybody they know. These techniques were named, taught, and reused, which is exactly what distinguishes a program from a grudge. Bad jacketing, forged correspondence, provoked conflict between rival groups, tax audits arranged through other agencies, employers telephoned, landlords written to. Every item on this list appears in the declassified record or in the Senate committee's findings. None of it is inference. This is the working vocabulary of a documented state program aimed at citizens. White herself is unusually restrained here. She does not claim that organized stalking is COINTELPRO continued. She does not claim the same agency, the same chain of command, the same anything. Her sentence is 5 words long and it makes exactly one claim. Certainly the tactics are similar. That restraint is the reason her argument survives scrutiny at all, and we are going to hold ourselves to the same standard. In 1975, the United States Senate created the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Everybody calls it the Church Committee after its chairman. Published in April 1976. The knowledge base describes its second volume, Intelligence Activities and the Rights of Americans, as the most authoritative government-sanctioned catalog of domestic surveillance and harassment ever produced. That is a state auditing itself in public on the record. Set the documented column beside the reported column. On the left, findings from the Senate report of 1976. On the right, what people who describe themselves as targets say is happening now. Letters to employers. Rumors in the neighborhood. Police who treat the complainant as the problem. Credibility destroyed rather than a body harmed. The match is close. But note carefully what the right-hand column is. Testimony, not finding. One word does more work in these files than any other. Neutralize. It appears in the program's own internal memoranda as the objective. Not arrest, not prosecution, not evidence gathered for a court. The aim was to destroy a person's effectiveness, their credibility, their capacity to act politically. That is a written intention to damage somebody without ever charging them. Hold that word. It is the hinge of the whole comparison. One case shows what a planted rumor can cost. In 1970, the Bureau's Los Angeles office, with the director's personal authorization, fed a false story to a Hollywood gossip columnist about the American actress Jean Seberg, who had donated money to the Black Panther Party. A magazine carried it internationally. She miscarried shortly afterwards, attempted suicide repeatedly, and died in Paris in 1979, aged 40. White does not cite this case herself. Look at how the damage actually traveled. Somebody plants the rumor. A publication repeats it. Neighbors, colleagues, and readers then act on what they now believe. The target's reputation collapses. And at the end, nobody is responsible because every person in the chain was only passing on what they had heard. That is the architecture of deniability, and White places precisely that mechanism at the center of organized stalking. It is also why nobody can be prosecuted. Now the caveat, and it is the most important sentence in this episode. Similar tactics are not proof of a current program. The Senate committee concluded that the programs ended in 1971. Scholars and journalists have questioned how thorough that ending really was, but no documentary chain has been established between COINTELPRO and the network's targets described today. Here the evidence runs out. Saying so is not weakness. It is the method. And the playbook was not American alone. In East Germany, the Ministry for State Security built an entire doctrine around it. The Germans called it Zersitzung, decomposition. The knowledge base describes it as one of the most extensively documented state programs of deniable harassment in modern history, formalized in a directive of 1976. Its purpose was explicit. Destroy a person without arresting them so that nothing appears to have happened. The methods are almost uncomfortably familiar. Entering a home and moving small objects. Slashed tires, broken windows, a flooded flat. Damage petty enough that the police would not investigate. Frequent enough to make a person feel permanently unsafe. Anonymous letters to employers and to spouses. Rumors placed with neighbors. And the knowledge base records, police responses kept deliberately dismissive so that the target learned reporting achieved nothing at all. That lesson was the point of the exercise. One more precedent, briefly. Project MKUltra, authorized by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1953, tested drugs, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation on subjects who were frequently unwitting. Most of its files were destroyed in 1973. So what we know survived largely by accident. It proves that a state was willing to experiment on its own citizens. It does not prove anything about today, and nobody should claim otherwise. That distinction matters more than the story does. So we have the playbook documented on 2 continents, admitted by the governments that ran it. What we do not have is a name, a budget line, or a chain of evidence reaching the present day. That is exactly where argument by resemblance stops. The next question is colder, and it has actual numbers attached to it. How many people report this, and what do the official crime statistics quietly contain? That precedent sets up the obvious question. If a state agency once ran coordinated harassment as policy, how many people today report something similar? White refuses to answer from anecdote. Instead, she does what almost nobody had bothered to do. She reads the government's own crime statistics, closely, line by line, and notices figures the authors published without ever pausing to explain them. The evidence, she argues, was hiding in plain sight. The standard dismissal runs like this. Organized stalking affects too few people to warrant serious attention. It is a fringe belief held by a handful of disturbed individuals, not a phenomenon of any statistical weight. That is an argument about numbers, so White answers it with numbers. Not her own numbers, which skeptics would discount on sight, but figures printed by the very agencies that say the crime does not exist. Her central exhibit is a United States Department of Justice special report, published in January 2009, titled Stalking Victimization in the United States. Its catalog number is NCJ 224527. It draws on the National Crime Victimization Survey, and it estimates that roughly 3.4 million American adults were stalked within a single 12-month period. Nothing about that document is fringe. It is the government's own baseline count. The headline finding is exactly what you would expect. 62% of stalking victims named a single stalker. 18% named two. That is the conventional picture, the lone obsessed individual, and it is the picture the anti-stalking laws of the 1990s were written to address. But the two smallest columns are the ones the report prints and then moves past without comment. Those are the ones White stops on. Add them together. 13% of victims reported 3 or more stalkers. A further 6.5% said they did not know how many stalkers they had. Combined, that is 19.6%, nearly 1 in 5, whose experience does not fit the lone stalker model at all. These are people pursued by a group, or by something that concealed its own size well enough that counting was simply impossible. Consider what that second category actually describes. Not a victim who lost count necessarily, but a victim who could never establish a count in the first place. Faces that rotate. Vehicles that change. Strangers who appear once and are never seen again. Multiple pursuers, no identifiable origin, and no way to name a suspect. That profile is, in White's reading, the statistical signature of organized stalking. It is a shape in the data, not proof of anything. Now the discipline this series insists on. A multi-perpetrator category inside a victimization survey is not a measurement of organized stalking. Nobody asked those respondents whether they believed an organized program was targeting them. The survey recorded how many stalkers a person perceived, and nothing more. What the figure represents is a gap in the data that is consistent with the claim. No more and no less. That distinction has to survive everything that follows. The second figure White flags concerns time. 11% of victims in that same report said they had been stalked for 5 years or more. Better than 1 in 9. Duration is the hardest variable in the whole dataset to explain away, because a respondent might misread a question or misattribute a single incident, but sustained harassment across half a decade is not something a person mistakes. Yet the report simply leaves it there. Think about what 5 years rules out. A jealous former partner, an obsessed fan, a motive-driven lone pursuer. These tend to burn out, get arrested, move on, or simply lose interest. One individual sustaining a campaign for half a decade without being caught or exhausted would be a remarkable feat of endurance. A network, by contrast, can rotate its members and keep going more or less indefinitely. That asymmetry is the whole of the argument. White's own comment on the perpetrator table is one cautious sentence, and the word doing the work is could. She is extrapolating, taking a survey estimate of roughly 3.4 million victims, applying the multi-stalker share, and arriving at a figure. That is an inference, not a count. No agency has ever counted organized stalking targets, for the simple reason that no agency records the category. So the 500,000 is a hypothesis. White then applies the same reading method abroad, and the pattern holds. Britain's Home Office estimated that in the year 2001, roughly 1.9 million people in the United Kingdom were victims of stalking or harassment at any one time. That is about 3 people in every 100. A population that large means even a small multi-perpetrator minority would run to tens of thousands of people. White treats that as scale, not as proof. The British data carried a second surprise. Around 45% of stalking victims were men, close to parity, in a crime the public imagines as a lone male pursuing a woman. White reads that as a hint that the aggregate contains a large category the conventional model never described. It is a hint, not a demonstration. Other explanations for a near-even gender split plainly exist, and she does not exclude them. Canada supplies a third dataset, and this one is not a survey. It is police records. Statistics Canada's figures on criminal harassment for 2006 covered nearly 11,000 incidents reported to police. 13% of them involved more than one accused. That is one criminal harassment report in 8, recorded by officers, entered in a national database, and never analyzed as a distinct category of crime. It sits there, counted and uninterpreted. The knowledge base holds one further document. In March 2010, a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Justice returned figures showing roughly 446,000 stalking episodes involving 3 or more perpetrators, of which about 185,000 involved offenders acting together. Treat that carefully. It comes from the same survey, released to a private requester rather than formally published. We report it and we mark its provenance. So why would a crime with this signature stay invisible to the instruments that count crime? Because every stage of the counting process filters it out. Each individual act is trivial or lawful. The victim cannot name a suspect. Without a named suspect, most anti-stalking procedures cannot even begin. No report is opened, no category is assigned, and the statistics then confirm that nothing happened. The loop closes and it closes on itself. Underreporting compounds all of it. The same Department of Justice research found that only about half of stalking victims reported the conduct to police at all. And of those who did, roughly 60% said police took no action. Nearly half endured at least one unwanted contact every week. Even conventional stalking with a nameable suspect drops out of the official record at that rate. Now imagine that filter applied to something far stranger. Targets describing this to researchers use a strikingly consistent vocabulary of refusal. Told nothing can be done. Advised to see a doctor. Reports filed that generate no investigation, no forensic work, no witness interviews. Those accounts come from the knowledge base's own corpus of target testimony. They are self-reported, and we cannot verify each one individually. What we can say is how uniform the pattern is across countries. Uniform and uniformly unrecorded. Here is the other side, stated plainly, because a documentary that hides it is not worth watching. No jurisdiction has written organized stalking into law as a distinct offense. Reviews of United States federal court cases involving these allegations have concluded that the claims lacked corroborating evidence. No coordinated harassment network of this kind has been verified in peer-reviewed research. That remains the mainstream position today. None of the figures we have just walked through change that. Both things are true at once, and holding both is the honest position. The government's own data contains a substantial multi-perpetrator, multi-year minority that the Lone Stalker model does not describe. And nobody has established what that minority actually is. The numbers open a question. They do not answer it. Here, precisely here, the evidence runs out, and everything past this point is inference. Everything else this series does depends on saying that clearly. Which leaves a practical problem rather than a philosophical one. If the instruments that count crime cannot see this conduct, then testimony will never register, however many people offer it. Changing that means changing the instruments themselves, how complaints are recorded, how multiple perpetrator cases are coded, how duration is tracked. And that is the ground the final part of this episode walks onto, what a way out might actually look like. Numbers can tell you how large something might be. They cannot tell you what to do about it. White's final chapter turns from description to prescription, and it is the most surprising part of her book, because after everything she has cataloged, it is hopeful. Not hopeful in a vague way. Hopeful in a practical, procedural, almost bureaucratic way. Her argument is that the machinery for a remedy already exists, and is simply not being used. White does not ask for exotic new legislation, or novel legal theory, or a special tribunal. She points instead at something easy to overlook. The anti-stalking laws written in the early 1990s are already on the books. They already criminalize the pattern that organized stalking consists of repeated, unwanted contact that causes a reasonable person fear. Her demand is not that new laws be written. It is that the existing ones be applied. That view is not whites alone. A shadow report circulated to California legislators, held in our knowledge base, makes the same claim in blunter language. These offenses, it argues, already violate existing state and federal statutes, and the laws are simply failing to compel enforcement. The report asks legislators for modernized wording anyway, not because the old wording is wrong, but because it has proved too easy for agencies to read narrowly. Every American state has a stalking statute. So do the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and most of Western Europe. The United States National Institute of Justice published a model anti-stalking code in 1993 to push those statutes toward a common shape. The coverage is close to universal. What varies, our knowledge-based notes, are the definitions, and what varies far more than the definitions is whether anyone enforces them. Here is the gap White is pointing at. Most stalking statutes describe a pattern of conduct. They rarely specify how many people may commit it. Nothing in the ordinary statutory language says a stalking charge collapses if the stalker turns out to be a group. But policing and prosecution run on training, not only on text, and the training assumes one pursuer with a name. Where the text is silent, the assumption fills the space. What that looks like from a front counter is documented in our knowledge base. Complainants report being told there is nothing the police can do, or being advised to see a doctor. Reports that are filed often go nowhere. No investigation, no forensic work, no witness interviews. The stated reasons are practical rather than hostile. Officers have no framework for networked harassment, no single suspect to name, and frequently no physical evidence to seize. It is worth remembering how recent all of this is. In 1985, stalking was not a crime anywhere in the United States. The behavior was prosecuted, if at all, under a patchwork of trespass and harassment provisions. California passed the first dedicated statute in 1990. Within 5 years, every state had one. A category that did not exist in law was named, and then, within a decade, it was everywhere. White's one specific legislative ask follows from that history. She wants organized stalking named explicitly in law, so that police and courts can no longer act as though the category does not exist. It is not a radical request. It is the ordinary route by which new crimes become crimes. The behavior happens. Victims complain. The complaints are dismissed because no box fits them. Evidence accumulates. Eventually the statute catches up and names the thing. Recognition sounds abstract until you ask what it would change on a Tuesday morning. For things concretely, a complaint filed as one pattern rather than 4 unrelated trivialities. A prosecutor able to charge a coordinated campaign rather than hunting a single suspect. A line in the crime statistics where multi-perpetrator cases are counted. And a page in the training manual so the officer at the counter has heard of this before. But White's deepest point is that this is not primarily a legislative battle at all. It is a battle for public awareness. The crime works because most people do not know the category exists, because witnesses who see a fragment do not recognize it, and because targets who try to explain are met with reflexive disbelief. Awareness breaks every link in that chain at once. It is the cheapest countermeasure available. That is her sentence, and it carries the weight of the whole chapter. It is almost tautological. A crime that depends on invisibility cannot survive being seen. But it is also strategic because it tells you where the fight actually is. Not in a courtroom first. In the ordinary knowledge of ordinary people. Give witnesses a framework. Give targets language that does not sound deranged. And the arithmetic of this crime changes. White's third prescription is procedural. She calls it the due process void. A target today has no visible accuser, no formal charge, no hearing, no verdict, and no appeal, and yet endures something that functions, in every practical sense, as a punishment. There is no mechanism to demand that the accusation be stated and tested, because the accusation is never stated. It circulates as rumor, as the unspoken premise behind 100 small encounters. The diagnosis is sharper than the remedy, and White says so. She offers no detailed solution here, only the observation that the position a target occupies exists in no jurisprudence that takes due process seriously. Punished without being charged, tried without being heard, sentenced without being convicted, and the system producing that outcome is informal and distributed, built from ordinary social interactions, which is precisely why the law cannot grip it. So what is actually missing is narrower than it first appears. Not new law, recognition, training, and the willingness to aggregate. Aggregation is the technical heart of it. The ability to take 40 incidents, each individually trivial and individually unprovable, and treat them as one course of conduct with one file number. That is exactly what stalking statutes were designed to do for a single pursuer. Nobody has been taught to do it for many. Where, then, is any of this actually moving? Our knowledge base points at a scatter of places rather than a single front. Advocacy asks to state legislatures. An old model code that standardized definitions. Human rights instruments that would cover covert electronic harassment if a state were proven to be doing it. And a newer body of law that did not exist when White wrote, and was not written with her readers in mind at all. That newer body of law is neurorights. In 2021, Chile became the first country to write mental privacy into its constitution. In 2024, Colorado amended its Privacy Act to treat neural data as sensitive personal information. Both were aimed at consumer brain-reading devices, not at covert targeting. But both establish a principle that had no legal existence before. The inside of your head is a place the law can protect. A realistic path to remedy, then, looks roughly like this, and every step is slow. Individuals document, in structured, time-stamped form. Those records get pooled so that patterns can be compared across people. The pooled evidence supports naming the category. Naming supports training and, eventually, a charge. And only then does any of it reach a courtroom, where it will be tested hard, and may well fail the first several times. And an honest caveat about Step 1. Personal incident logs, the 1,000-event memory logs some targets keep, have no recognized evidentiary value in court, as our knowledge base states plainly. Critics also warn they can entrench confirmation bias, cataloging what fits and discarding what does not. That does not make logging pointless. It makes logging insufficient on its own. What courts want is corroboration. Independent records, timestamps, witnesses, documents that someone else produced. Let us keep the hope proportionate. Nothing in this chapter is a promise. No statute is pending that would settle the question. No senior court has ruled on the substance. The evidence for large-scale organized targeting remains contested, and the legal recognition White asks for has not arrived in the 2 decades since she wrote. What she offers is not a forecast. It is a direction of travel, and an argument that the direction is not absurd. And White is not the only one making it. The same demand has been put to state legislatures, to human rights bodies, and to the United Nations by organizations that existed long before this series began. It has also been put by a community that learned, slowly, to organize itself. That is where we go next. Beyond one country, beyond one author, to the international dimension and to the people who refuse to stay quiet. That road toward justice does not begin and end inside one country. Before we close this chapter, we have to widen the frame, because the account you have heard so far was assembled mainly in the United States, from American cases, American statutes, and American statistics. If the picture is real, it should not stop at a border. So the fair question is simple. What do targets outside the United States describe, and what does their testimony prove? Target communities exist and have existed for decades in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, across Western and Eastern Europe, in Russia, in parts of Asia, and in Latin America. The knowledge base entry on gang stalking records the same spread, naming India among the countries where the vocabulary took hold. Translate that testimony, line it up, and the structure repeats. The same menu, the same staging, the same deniability. Eleanor White states it flatly in her field guide. Her words: "Since we targets network with one another in all industrialized nations, we know that organized stalking is a crime which is worldwide in scope." Note what that sentence is and what it is not. It is a report of what a network of correspondents told her. It is not a survey, and White never claimed it was one. In Germany, the conversation often runs under a different word, Zersetzung. It translates roughly as decomposition or undermining. It was the East German secret police's own term for a program of psychological warfare against dissidents, and it is not a rumor. It sits in the Stasi's internal files, declassified after reunification and administered by the federal agency created to manage that archive. This is documented history, not testimony, and the distinction matters here. Read the Stasi's method against White's menu and the overlap is uncomfortable. Rumor campaigns, staged coincidences, engineered isolation from friends, employers, and neighbors, the systematic destruction of a person's standing. The Stasi did not need to prove a dissident had broken any law. It needed to make that life unlivable and that voice inaudible. Those two lists were compiled decades apart, by people with no connection to each other. The resemblance is real and it is not proof. Hold that thought carefully because it is easy to overspend. Zersetzung proves that a state security service once ran exactly this kind of campaign at scale on its own citizens and wrote the manuals down. It proves the method is buildable and has been built. It does not prove who, if anyone, is running such a campaign in a Western democracy today. Precedent establishes possibility. It never establishes a present perpetrator. The United Kingdom shows how much the legal frame matters. The Protection from Harassment Act of 1997 defines harassment as a course of conduct, a pattern rather than a single incident, and it puts no limit on the number of people who can be responsible. On paper, that fits group harassment better than most American stalking statutes. In practice, British targets report the same wall. The complaint sounds implausible and the referral goes to mental health. Canada gives us the one number in this chapter that comes from a national statistical agency. Statistics Canada recorded nearly 11,000 criminal harassment incidents in 2006. In 13% of them, more than one person was accused. That is not a measurement of organized stalking. It is a statistical signature that is at least consistent with it, sitting quietly inside ordinary crime data, unremarked and uninvestigated. David Lawson's undercover work also crossed the border. He began from bases in Florida and New York State and followed what he was documenting into Canada, which suggests the groups he observed were not organized around national boundaries. Canadian targets have since contributed heavily to the online communities where all of this is discussed. Lawson's observations are one investigator's field notes. We will weigh them properly, and his conclusions separately in a later part. So what does the cross-border consistency actually establish? There are 3 live explanations, and honesty requires all 3 on the table. 1. A real coordinated phenomenon whose shape is fixed by the practical demands of harassment. 2. A narrative that spread online, giving very different kinds of distress one shared vocabulary. 3. A mixed population containing both in proportions nobody has measured. This series does not get to skip the second one. Here is that second explanation drawn as fairly as we can draw it. A person experiences something frightening and unexplained. They search online. They find a fully formed framework with names for every part. They reread their own past through it. What they then report converges with everyone else who took the same route, and the convergence is real without the coordination being real. That mechanism is well established in other fields. What would tell the two apart? Testimony recorded before the online communities existed. Targets in languages and places with no contact with English language forums. And the difference between surface detail, which does vary by culture, and deep structure, which does not appear to. The chapter's own verdict is careful. The core structure looks invariant, and that invariance is consistent with a real phenomenon. Consistent with, here the available evidence genuinely runs out. Which brings us to what the targets did about it. Because while institutions declined to investigate, the people describing this did something that no one had asked them to do. They found each other. Over 3 decades, a scattered set of isolated individuals became a globally distributed community with its own vocabulary, its own conferences, its own archives, and its own quarrels. That community is now part of the evidence and part of the problem. The mechanism was ordinary: mailing lists, message boards, personal websites, later social media and video. What happened inside it was not ordinary. Targets who had told no one, or had told someone once and regretted it, met strangers in other countries describing the same convoys, the same noise, the same staged encounters in the same words. The chapter calls that effect epistemologically transformative. In plainer language, you stop wondering whether you are mad. That convergence is the community's strongest argument, and the chapter states it directly. Take the sentence seriously, but notice its limits. It does not rule out shared narrative diffusion, which can also produce convergence. What it does rule out is the laziest dismissal. That thousands of people, independently and in isolation, invented the same detailed script by coincidence. Something is generating the pattern. The remaining argument is about what, and that is a much narrower question. The infrastructure is real and it is listed in the knowledge base. Freedom from covert harassment and surveillance. The International Center Against Abuse of Covert Technologies. The European Coalition Against Covert Harassment. Mind Justice. Older nodes like Multi-Stalker Victims and the Mind Control Forums Archive, and Eleanor White's own site, raven1.net. Some are active. Some survive only as web archive captures. Conferences ran in American cities, and smaller gatherings elsewhere. Out of that community came a documentation culture. The knowledge base describes it plainly. A compulsive need to record everything, which one report frames not as paranoia but as a survival strategy. Date, time, place, description, sometimes an impact rating. 2 honest cautions come with it. Such logs carry no automatic standing in a courtroom, and critics note that a log can quietly collect only the events that fit. Neither caution is a reason to stop. A word about health offered carefully, because this series does not tell anyone what is happening to them or what to do about it. One thing here is not contested. The medical literature summarized by Physicians for Human Rights shows that sleep restriction alone, for hours a night for under a week, raises blood pressure and inflammation and disturbs glucose control. Whatever the cause of the lost sleep, the damage is physiological. Which is where this series sits, and we should be straight about it. One Voice is one node in that long tradition, not its hero. A documentation platform run by a nonprofit, where testimony is recorded in a structured, comparable form rather than lost in a comment thread. TITV carries the interviews and the analysis. The tradition is far older than this project, and it will certainly outlast it. That is the road ahead. Chapter 2 takes apart the master menu of tactics. Chapter 3 asks why me. Chapter 4 examines Lawson's 12 years undercover. Then the statistical record, the psychological profiles, the clinical double-bind, and the historical precedents. Part 2 moves to the contested technology claim by claim. Before we get there, though, we owe you a summary of what this chapter established and what it did not. That community is where this account now lives, and it is also where Part 1 comes to a close. Before we let you go, we are going to do something this subject rarely gets: an honest accounting. What have we actually established? What is still only a claim? And where, precisely, does the evidence stop? Everything the next 49 parts attempt is built on the ground we have covered in the last 2 hours. At the start of this episode, we promised 5 questions. What is this thing? Why does it land on one person and not another? Has anyone ever seen it from the inside? How large might it really be? And why has almost nobody in authority ever looked? We will take them in order, and we will be strict about the difference between an answer, a partial answer, and an honest blank. The first answer is the firmest one, because it is a definition rather than a discovery. Organized stalking, as Eleanor White frames it, has 3 parts. Many people, not one. Strangers working from a name on a list, rather than an obsessive who already knows you. And a structure that reaches beyond one street or one town, which is why moving house, in target after target, brings no relief at all. The second question is the one this episode answers least well, and we should say so plainly. Why you? White records that targets are almost never told. There is no accuser to face, no charge to answer, no hearing and no appeal. Her taxonomy of how people are selected, and her estimate that most targets fit none of the known categories, belongs to Part 3. What Part 1 established is the void where due process should be. The third question has the most interesting answer of the 5. David Lawson, a private investigator and former police officer, spent roughly 12 years following these groups, after stumbling onto their radio traffic with an ordinary scanner. His observations of vehicles, shifts, and rotations match target testimony closely. His conclusions about who runs it, and why, remain contested, and Eleanor White herself insists on keeping the two apart. So do we? The fourth question is scale, and here the official numbers are quietly interesting. In the Department of Justice victimization study, 62% of stalking victims perceived a single offender. 18% perceived 2, 13% perceived 3 or more, and a further 6.5% did not know. White added those last 2 together and read nearly 1 in 5 as sitting outside the lone stalker model. That reading is her inference, not the department's finding. One number resists the easy explanations. About 11% of stalking victims, roughly 1 in 9, reported being pursued for 5 years or more. Obsession usually burns out. Grudges cool. Individual pursuers get arrested, move away, or lose interest. A campaign that runs for half a decade implies either extraordinary persistence from one person or something with a structure behind it. The statistic cannot tell us which. It tells us the category exists and has never been examined. The fifth question was the cover-up, and the honest answer is that the word may be the wrong one. We found no evidence of anybody concealing a program. What we found instead is a structure in which concealment is unnecessary, because reporting the crime produces evidence against the person reporting it. Each act is trivial. The pattern is invisible to everyone except the target. And the complaint itself can be heard as the symptom. Stack those together and you have the architecture. At street level, every act is dressed as ordinary bad luck. At the social level, a rumor campaign strips away the witnesses who might otherwise have corroborated anything. At the institutional level, the complaint is heard as a symptom rather than as a report. Nobody needs to hide a single thing. The design does the hiding, and it does it in plain sight. Which brings us to the way out, and White's argument that it is narrower than people expect. The laws largely exist already. Stalking, harassment, conspiracy, criminal nuisance. What is missing is recognition. A police report that survives the front desk. An investigator trained to aggregate incidents rather than dismiss them one at a time. A prosecutor able to charge a group. And a box on a form where this can finally be counted. Now the harder half of the accounting, and the part this series refuses to skip. If you take one thing away from the last 2 hours, let it be this. A pattern in the testimony is not a proven mechanism. A documented historical precedent is not a current program. And a gap in the crime statistics is not a measurement of anything. Here is exactly where the evidence, honestly assessed, runs out. For gaps stated plainly, there is no declassified contemporary program, no budget line, no internal document that anyone has produced. There is no forensic demonstration of the electronic claims under instrumented conditions. No agency anywhere counts multi-perpetrator stalking as a category, so nobody knows the real number. And the striking similarity of testimony across borders has more than one possible cause. Each of those is unfinished business rather than a rhetorical concession. Take the alternatives seriously because they are not stupid. A shared narrative traveling online could produce convergent accounts with no coordination behind them at all. Some proportion of people who believe they are targeted are, on any reasonable estimate, unwell. And ordinary harassment, from ordinary neighbors, can be misread as orchestration. This series does not adjudicate between those explanations and the communities. It insists only that each be tested rather than assumed. So we sort the material into 2 columns and we keep them strictly apart. On one side, what is documented, the Bureau's multi-perpetrator figures, the Church Committee findings, the Stasi files on decomposition tactics, the mobbing research, and the absence of due process. On the other, what remains contested, any present-day coordinated program, the electronic layer, who would direct it, and the estimate that most targets fit no known category. Everything ahead is, in effect, a test of what we built today. Part 2 takes the master menu apart, tactic by tactic. Part 3 asks why me. Part 4 puts the 3-part definition up against Lawson's 12 years of observation. Part 5 goes deeper into the numbers. Part 7 examines the clinical encounter. Part 8 expands the historical precedent. If this foundation is wrong, those parts are where it will show. Eleanor White never wrote a word about revenge. Her book is about description because description was the only instrument she had. But the line most readers carry away is not about tactics at all. It is about standing. About what it means to be judged by a process you cannot see, cannot answer, and cannot appeal. That, more than any single tactic, is the injury at the center of this subject. Our anchors were these. Eleanor White's Organized Stalking. A Target's View. Knowledge Base number 765. David Lawson's 2 published books. The Department of Justice Study on Stalking Victimization. The Statistics Canada Harassment Figures. The Church Committee Reports of 1975 and 1976. And the German Archive of Stasi Records. Supporting research came from the TI One Voice knowledge base. Every image credit is listed in full in the companion article. If any of this sounded familiar, you are not carrying it alone. TI One Voice is a platform built by targeted individuals for targeted individuals. An evidence library, a knowledge base of thousands of documents, a community wall, and documentation tools designed for exactly the kind of pattern that is hard to prove. TITV runs alongside it around the clock. Both are free, and the links are in the description. Part 1 defines the crime. Part 2 dissects it. The anatomy of gang stalking opens the master menu properly. Street theater, noise campaigns, vehicle convoys, the roles that people play inside a campaign, and the settings where the tactics land most reliably, which are the workplace, the campus, and the neighborhood. If Part 1 asked what this thing is, Part 2 asks what a single day inside it looks like. A crime engineered to be unseeable can only be undone by being seen, described carefully, and counted honestly. That is the entire purpose of this series, and of the 50 parts that carry it. Thank you for staying with us for 2 hours on a subject that is difficult in every direction. Look after yourself, take your time, and we will see you in part 2, the anatomy of gang stalking.